In early 1944, the fate of Europe rested on a single decision. Nazi Germany still controlled most of Western Europe, and despite years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, the war was far from over. Adolf Hitler's armies remained powerful, heavily fortified along the Atlantic coast, and determined to stop any Allied invasion before it could begin. For years, the Western Allies had promised to open a second front to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. But launching such an invasion was one of the most dangerous military operations ever attempted. Tens of thousands of soldiers would have to cross the English Channel under enemy fire, land on heavily defended beaches, and break through a wall of German defenses stretching across France. The man responsible for planning and leading this operation was Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe. Eisenhower was not known as the most aggressive or flamboyant general of the war. Instead, his strength lay in something far more difficult: coordinating enormous armies, managing powerful personalities, and holding together an alliance of nations that did not always agree on strategy. Under his command were British, American, Canadian, and other Allied forces, all preparing for the same objective: breaking into Hitler's fortress Europe. The invasion plan was known as Operation Overlord, and if it failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. A failed landing could cost tens of thousands of lives and delay the liberation of Europe for years. Even worse, it could give Germany time to reinforce its defenses and prolong the war indefinitely. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Over months of preparation, southern England transformed into a massive military staging ground. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers arrived from across the United States and the British Empire, training relentlessly for an assault that most of them knew would be deadly. Thousands of ships were assembled in secret ports, while engineers constructed artificial harbors that could be transported across the sea after the invasion. Aircraft filled the skies over Britain as Allied air forces intensified bombing campaigns against German infrastructure in France. Meanwhile, German forces along the Atlantic coast were strengthening what they called the Atlantic Wall, a vast network of bunkers, artillery batteries, mines, and defensive obstacles designed to stop an invasion before it reached the beaches. German commanders believed that if they could destroy the invasion force in the first hours of landing, the Allies would never recover from the loss. The stakes were clear to everyone involved. Eisenhower understood that the first day of the invasion could determine the outcome of the entire campaign. Yet even as the preparations intensified, uncertainty remained. Weather conditions in the English Channel were unpredictable, and a storm at the wrong moment could scatter the invasion fleet or prevent reinforcements from reaching the beaches. German intelligence was also searching desperately for clues about where the invasion would occur. To increase the chances of success, Allied planners launched one of the most elaborate deception campaigns of the war, convincing German commanders that the main attack would come further north near Pas-de-Calais, rather than the beaches of Normandy. For Eisenhower, the final decision was approaching rapidly. Hundreds of thousands of men were ready, ships were loaded, aircraft were prepared, and the largest amphibious invasion in history stood on the edge of becoming reality. But one unpredictable factor remained beyond anyone's control: the weather. In early June 1944, violent storms swept across the English Channel, threatening to delay the operation indefinitely. Eisenhower now faced one of the most difficult decisions of the war. If he waited too long, the invasion window could close entirely. If he launched the attack in dangerous, conditions, thousands of soldiers might never even reach the beaches. In the early hours of June 5th, the Supreme Allied Commander gathered his senior officers and listened carefully as meteorologists delivered their final forecast. The decision he made in that moment would send more than 150,000 soldiers into one of the deadliest battlefields of World War II. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the operation that Dwight D. Eisenhower had spent months preparing finally began. Before the first Allied soldiers reached the beaches of Normandy, the invasion started in darkness high above France. Thousands of paratroopers from American and British airborne divisions were dropped behind German lines in an attempt to seize bridges, disrupt communications, and create confusion among the defenders. Many of these airborne units landed far from their intended drop zones. Pilots struggled to navigate through heavy clouds and anti-aircraft fire, scattering soldiers across the Norman countryside. Small groups of paratroopers found themselves isolated in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by enemy forces and unsure where their fellow soldiers had landed. Yet, despite the chaos, these scattered troops began carrying out their objectives. Bridges were captured, road junctions were blocked, and German reinforcements were slowed before the main invasion had even begun. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, one of the largest invasion fleets in history moved slowly toward the French coast. Thousands of ships filled the sea, carrying soldiers, tanks, artillery, and supplies. Battleships and cruisers prepared to bombard the German defenses that guarded the coastline. As dawn approached, the massive armada came within range of the heavily fortified German positions that were part of the Atlantic Wall. German commanders had long expected an Allied invasion, but they remained uncertain about where it would occur. Some believed Normandy might be a diversion, still convinced that the main attack would take place further north near Pas-de-Calais. This uncertainty slowed the German response during the critical early hours of the battle. Just after sunrise, the first Allied landing craft began approaching the beaches. The invasion zone stretched across 5 separate landing areas along the Normandy coast, each with its own challenges and defenses. For the soldiers packed inside the small landing craft, the final minutes before reaching shore were filled with tension and fear. As the ramps dropped and the boats opened toward the beaches, German machine guns and artillery opened fire. At some locations, the landings progressed relatively quickly, with Allied forces managing to push inland despite heavy resistance. At others, the situation was far more dangerous. The American landings at Omaha Beach quickly turned into one of the most brutal battles of the entire invasion. German defenders, positioned on the high cliffs above the beach, had clear lines of fire across the narrow strip of sand. Landing craft were destroyed before reaching shore, and many soldiers found themselves trapped under intense machine gun fire the moment they stepped into the water. Chaos spread across the beach as units became separated and officers struggled to reorganize their men under constant attack. For several hours it appeared possible that the landings might fail entirely at Omaha. Yet slowly, small groups of soldiers began finding ways to move forward. Using shell craters and the limited cover available along the beach, they crawled toward the base of the cliffs. Engineers cleared obstacles, and explosives were used to destroy German defensive positions. By mid-morning, scattered Allied troops had managed to break through the strongest parts of the German line. Once the first units reached the top of the cliffs, the balance of the battle began to shift. German defenders, who had dominated the beaches, suddenly found themselves exposed to attacks from behind. Across the Invasion zone Allied forces gradually expanded their foothold in Normandy. By the end of the day, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers had landed in France. The invasion that Eisenhower had authorized, despite dangerous weather conditions, had succeeded in establishing a beachhead. But the cost had been severe. Thousands of soldiers had been killed or wounded during the landings, and the fighting was far from over. The invasion had opened the door to the deadliest battlefield in Western Europe during World War II, and the struggle to break out of Normandy would prove just as brutal as the landings themselves. By the end of June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion had succeeded in establishing a fragile foothold in France. More than 150,000 soldiers had landed along the Normandy coast, and despite fierce resistance, the beachheads held. But the battle was far from over. In many ways, the most difficult phase of the campaign was only beginning. The German army still controlled the countryside. Beyond the beaches, and powerful armored divisions were moving toward the invasion zone. The Allied soldiers who had survived the landings now faced a brutal struggle to expand their positions inland. The terrain of Normandy quickly proved to be one of the greatest obstacles. Instead of open fields where tanks and large formations could maneuver freely, much of the region was divided by thick hedgerows, narrow sunken roads, and small villages that provided natural defensive positions. German troops used this landscape to their advantage, turning every field and every crossroads into a potential ambush. Progress for Allied forces became slow and costly as they fought through what many soldiers described as a maze of natural fortifications. For Dwight D. Eisenhower, the situation was both urgent and dangerous. The entire success of Operation Overlord depended on the Allies breaking out of Normandy before German reinforcements could organize a massive counterattack. If the invasion forces remained trapped near the coast for too long, the Germans might be able to push them back into the sea. German commanders understood this as well. Elite armored units, including several panzer divisions, began moving toward the front in an attempt to contain the Allied advance. Some of the most experienced German troops on the Western Front were now preparing to strike back. Throughout June and July, the fighting across Normandy became a grinding battle of attrition. Allied forces launched repeated attacks against heavily defended German positions, while the Germans fought stubbornly to hold their ground. Entire villages were reduced to rubble as artillery and airstrikes pounded defensive lines. One of the most intense struggles centered around the strategic city of Caen, which British and Canadian forces had been expected to capture on the first day of the invasion. Instead, German armored units turned the city into a stronghold, forcing the Allies into weeks of costly combat. Meanwhile, American forces in the western sector pushed slowly through the hedgerow country, often advancing only a few hundred meters at a time. The battle became a test of endurance for both sides. Allied commanders began searching for a way to break the stalemate and regain momentum. By late July, they developed a plan for a massive breakthrough operation. The strategy relied on overwhelming air power and concentrated ground assaults to shatter the German defensive line. When the attack began, waves of Allied bombers struck German positions with devastating force, creating a sudden gap in the enemy front. American forces quickly pushed through the opening, launching a rapid advance that caught German commanders off guard. The operation, known as Operation Cobra, marked the turning point of the Normandy campaign. Once the German lines began to collapse, Allied armies moved quickly to exploit the breakthrough. Armored units raced across the countryside, threatening to encircle large numbers of German troops who had been fighting near the beaches for weeks. The battle that followed would determine whether the German army in France could escape or be destroyed entirely. As Allied forces surged forward, the German commanders faced a rapidly closing trap that could wipe out one of their largest armies in Western Europe. The next phase of the campaign would bring some of the most decisive fighting since the invasion began, and it would confirm whether Eisenhower's gamble in Normandy had truly opened the road to victory in World War II. By August 1944, the balance of the war in Western Europe was shifting rapidly. The breakthrough created by Operation Cobra had shattered the German defensive line in Normandy, and Allied forces were advancing faster than at any point since the invasion began. Armored divisions pushed deep into the French countryside, capturing towns and cutting off major roads that German troops depended on for movement and supply. For weeks, the German army had fought fiercely to contain the Allied landings near the coast, but now the battlefield was expanding beyond their control. Many German units suddenly found themselves retreating under constant pressure from Allied ground forces and relentless air attacks. The Allied strategy quickly evolved into something even more ambitious. Instead of simply pushing the German army eastward across France, commanders saw an opportunity to surround and destroy large portions of Hitler's forces in a massive encirclement. At the center of this effort remained Dwight D. Eisenhower, coordinating multiple Allied armies as they advanced from different directions. American forces moved north and east, while British and Canadian troops pushed southward to close the gap. German commanders soon realized they were facing the danger of being trapped inside a narrowing pocket. If the Allies managed to seal the escape routes completely, tens of thousands of German soldiers could be cut off with no chance of retreat. What followed became one of the most dramatic moments of the Normandy campaign. The battle that emerged around the town of Falaise quickly turned into a desperate race between two armies. German units attempted to escape eastward, while Allied forces closed in from both sides. The result was the brutal struggle known as the Falaise Pocket. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, attacking columns of retreating German vehicles that stretched along the roads leading out of the pocket. Destroyed tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks filled the countryside as the encirclement tightened. Inside the shrinking corridor, German soldiers attempted to break through the Allied lines in chaotic waves. Some units managed to escape under cover of darkness, but thousands were trapped as Allied forces gradually sealed the opening. The battlefield became a scene of devastation, as abandoned equipment and destroyed vehicles littered the fields and roads of Normandy. When the pocket finally closed in late August, much of the German army in France had been either destroyed or forced into a disorganized retreat. The victory opened the road for the Allied advance across France, allowing their forces to move rapidly toward the German border. Cities that had been under Nazi occupation for years began to fall one after another as German defenses collapsed. The success of the Normandy campaign confirmed that the massive invasion Eisenhower had authorized just weeks earlier had fundamentally changed the course of the war. What began as a risky landing on heavily defended beaches had evolved into a campaign that broke the strength of Germany's forces in Western Europe. For the Allies, the road to Germany was now open. For Nazi Germany, the consequences were irreversible. The battlefield that Eisenhower had led the Allied armies into would become one of the decisive fronts that ultimately led to the defeat of Hitler's regime and the end of World War II in Europe.